Hi, I'm Asher Martin, and this is my presentation on the CSI bias and the verdict. So according to the Baldani Law Group, about 2 million people are in the United States prison systems, with about 5% of those people being wrongfully convicted. This means that there are about 12,000 people in prison for a crime they did not commit. They also say out of 195,000 convictions each year, around 975 of those are truly innocent. As seen on this graph here, forensic evidence is responsible for about a little under half of wrongful convictions. When people think of forensic evidence, they think of fingerprints or DNA most often, because television shows have sensationalized the use of these types of evidence. More often than not, DNA and fingerprints are seen as infallible. However, neither of these types are actually infallible. Some sources that I used. The first one, in a study conducted by Lisa Smith and Ray Bull at the University of Leicester, Smith and Bull used a group of their psychology students to study the effect of a pretrial bias in jury members. They had previously constructed a fictional criminal court case in another trial and decided to use it in this study. They had the students read the case thoroughly and then had them act as a mock jury. They constructed the forensic evidence evaluation bias scale and used a principal component analysis to find that two kinds of bias existed in a jury. They found that there was the existence of either a pro-prosecution bias or a pro-defense bias. They also found that those with a pro-prosecution bias tended to lean more heavily on forensic evidence as concrete and strong, while those with a pro-defense were more weary to trust the evidence. The study proved the existence of a pretrial bias, but never went into specific details about what actually caused these biases, which is what my study was conducted to find out. Based on whether a jury member has seen evidence presented in TV shows where the prosecution typically makes well-constructed evidence presentations that sounds infallible, they can take these small mistakes and see them as faulty evidence and make the wrong verdict. Donald Shelton from the University of Michigan dives deeper into the interpretation of the jury by investigating the standard for non-forensic evidence in relation to the trial judge. He conducted a review of 137 exoneration cases and what the actual cause behind them was. He says under Rule 702, the trial judge must preliminarily assess the scientific validity of the testimonies, underlying reasoning or methodology, and determine whether it can be properly applied to the facts it issues. The trial judges must examine whether an expert's conclusions are sufficiently reliable. He suggests that it is much more likely to have a pro-prosecution bias because forensic evidence can be very difficult to refute if presented in the right way and to seem leading and concrete. His study shows that jury members are much more likely to think of forensic evidence as infallible over other types of evidence. Therefore, the way that crime television and other sources of crime media portray this evidence may increase a jury's members' confidence in a piece of evidence. Finally, in a study by Glenda Cooper and Vanessa Materko that investigated the correlation between biases and the verdicts, they studied the effect of cognitive bias. The two researchers conducted a systematic review of the literature on cognitive bias in forensic science disciplines. They defined cognitive bias as a broad term that includes a wide variety of processes that may lead to inaccurate judgments or interpretations. Their studies concluded that there was a clear cognitive bias in juries. The two studies among fingerprint analysts on the effect of emotional context or seriousness of a crime or suitability decision-making provide differing results. This may be a less important avenue for future research than other questions, but still important. This was a connection between fingerprint evidence and the bias of a jury. The focus on fingerprint evidence brought the validity of fingerprint evidence in comparison to television's portrayal of it into question. Here's my methodology. So for this paper, I used a qualitative analysis of an anonymous survey. The survey was composed of a fictional, abridged version of a criminal court case and a brief questionnaire distributed to a limited number of respondents within the Brophy community. The case presented a series of fingerprints purposely posed to be misleading. The presentation of the evidence was also meant to be ambiguous through the use of an expert witness testifying to the matching of the fingerprints. A cross-examination from the defense was purposely left out to keep the reader biased towards the presentation of evidence without the possibility to hear a rebuttal. Respondents were then prompted to answer questions about their general demographics, and about their trends in crime media consumption. The questions included information such as race, age, education levels, class rigor, and political affiliations. The results obtained from the short questionnaire were quantitatively analyzed using a mix of numerical values and graphs. This methodology was best suited for the study because of the use of a fictional crime case in Smith and Bull's study, while keeping along with the target objective of evaluating crime media's effect on the jury and the verdict. Here is the first print presented to the respondents in the study. The print is very hard to distinguish between a match or not. While both prints have a wave feature in the center of the print, the curves around the prints are slightly different and have different divergent features around it. Here's a second one with also the same wave pattern, where you can see that around it, it's a lot different than this one's the more tougher one to differentiate between. So here's some results from my study that gave some interesting and contradictory results from original research and hypotheses. Overall, the percentage of respondents who correctly chose the non-guilty verdict was 56.9%. Relatively speaking, this was a very low percentage and raises some concerns. However, when taking a closer look at the results, it shows that 62.5% of respondents who clicked yes for consumption of crime-based media chose the correct verdict, while a smaller 50% of respondents who clicked no chose the correct verdict. Another interesting pattern that emerged was the respondents who said they had hands-on lecture experience with forensic were incorrect about the verdict about 80% of the time. This was a surprising factor because when thinking about it, it could be assumed that that would directly correlate to a higher verdict. However, this data shows the opposite trend. People with hands-on experience picked the incorrect verdict 80% of the time. Another result was that the majority of respondents were relatively unaware of the processes of forensics, with an average response of 2.375 on a 5-point scale when asked about familiarity with forensics. This raises a concern over the level of education around forensic science and its processes. The most obvious and target trend of the study was a correlation between the choice of verdict and consumption of crime-based media. The purpose of this paper was to investigate the existence of a pre-trial bias based on crime television and other media in favor of a guilty verdict. It was assumed that consumption of crime-based media would lead to a higher reliance and bias towards the evidence presented. However, with the data that came through the survey, there was a trend that showed crime media and correct verdict submissions were almost the exact same number. And it showed that crime-based media might actually be correlated to a higher percent of correct verdicts. Through the fictional court case, even those without forensic knowledge and less consumption of crime-based media could have seen through the presentation of evidence. When presented with the data that came out of the survey, it can be seen that the language in the case was able to persuade a sizable percentage of the respondents. 43% of respondents responded with the incorrect verdict. Exactly half the respondents, 16 of 32, who answered they did not consume crime-based media chose the correct verdict. This shows that having no prior knowledge of the forensic process leads to unsureness and inconsistencies with verdicts. While respondents with prior knowledge and consumption of crime media only had 12.5% higher correct verdicts, the prior knowledge seems to assist in the jury process. This upward trend in correct verdicts could be due to a familiarity with the terms of forensic evidence. If a respondent was familiar with these terms, they would be less likely to be swayed by the use of them. However, with 80% of educated responders giving the incorrect verdict, it brings awareness to a possible lack of depth in forensic science education. A possible explanation for this result could be from the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is defined as a cognitive bias in which people of less knowledge tend to overestimate their ability or confidence. In this case, those with no knowledge of forensic evidence could have seen through the holes in the case because they're not aware of all the intricacies of fingerprinting. However, those with the experience may take a closer look at the language and the exhibits and try to work their way through a verdict. The extra time and examination from the experienced respondents could have convinced them that the fingerprints did in fact match. As this research is being conducted, there is much need for education on forensic processes. With the correlation between knowledge of forensic science and the correct verdict, education needs to be put in place. The best process of education needs to be researched and conducted through all levels of study throughout the globe. While crime-based media is not a reliable source of information, it proved to assist in the process of correctly identifying mismatched fingerprints. In the future, studies should be conducted on the media's specific influence on how jury members interpret the evidence presented. Forensic evidence decides the fate of too many people each year to be out of reach from the general public's knowledge and education systems. The question about whether a pretrial bias from crime-based media shows and existed and what effect it has on the verdict was proven to exist, but actually correlate to a higher percent of correct verdicts. However, the actual way that these sources actually affect the jury members' bias is still unknown. Overall, more research is still needed to actually know the specific effect that crime-based media has on the verdict. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Asher. We have 3 questions, and then I'll wrap it up for you here. So for question 1, how did you determine which results that were generated by your research method were the most important in forming your new understanding? Tell us about that process.
So the first one I chose was out of all the who chose the correct verdict. So I chose that one because it's the most obvious to see the trend and correlation with the people who responded with consumption of crime media. And I saw that those two were the same percentage, so I saw the connection between those two. But then I also chose the one about educated respondents because it was the most shocking result. Because you would expect it to be opposite. You'd expect the educated people to respond with the correct verdict, but 80% of them chose the wrong verdict. So I put that one in there because that was an interesting fact.
Okay. Terrific. And then as a follow-up to that, what are the real-world implications or consequences related to your findings?
So it's found that the education system around forensics can actually be faulty. I myself have done a bunch of education around forensics, and when I first looked at those fingerprints, I thought they matched, but they weren't. So I see a bunch of inconsistencies with how people are taught about forensic evidence, and I think that just needs to be implemented in the future.
Okay. And then as a final question, if you could revisit your overall process from beginning to end, what specific thing would you do differently, and why would you change that?
I think I would try to do it where it's an actual trial, because I feel it's a lot different when you're reading a case study when actually watching something, because when you're watching a presentation of evidence, there's certain key factors in mannerisms or the presentation that can alter people's opinions on it. And I think you don't get that through an actual reading of a court case.